And we are live. Welcome, viewers. Welcome, listeners, to Religion Zero number 53.
Hey.
Quite an accomplishment, man. Quite an accomplishment, must say. And I'm joined today by my good friend, CONK. How are you doing, my friend? Have you had a good week?
It's been a lot of ups and downs. I quit smoking this week.
Oh, my.
I got quite a few days through, and then I could not function at work. So I smoked during work. And the last 2 days, because I could not function, and I really had a lot of crap I got to do. I actually ended up clocking in on Saturday trying to make up the work I didn't do during the week. So, so I gotta find a healthy balance here, trying to figure out what I should do with that. And I also feel like my head's really far down, so maybe I should move this slightly.
Yeah. Try maybe center yourself a little bit.
How's
that's
that?
Better. Yeah.
Progress? Yeah. I'm also wearing a hoodie because it's hot as balls outside. So the renters upstairs are cranking the AC, and the basement gets like 80% of it, and upstairs gets 20% of it. So my house has been like 55 degrees all the time.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Well,
it's like 100. You like the cold.
Yeah, but it's been like 4 days straight, and now my hands hurt. And
no.
So it's kind of funny that it's 100 degrees outside, but I'm wearing a hoodie in my basement all weekend. So that's fun.
Pretty wild.
Yeah. How about you? I know you went to a Model UN, right?
Not quite.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm doing well. Well, yeah, I don't know if I mentioned this on the last show. I went out to London. What was it? Probably 2 weeks ago. For the Trinidad and Tobago Association of the UK. We did a soup kitchen. Ooh. And yeah, trying to help the homeless. And it was the first time I'm meeting a lot of the board members of this new charity that I'm a part of. It was an interesting time. A bit of fireworks went off between the board, but that's, new board, you expect some friction. Gave out a lot of food, helped a lot of people. Lots of pictures with I think the deputy mayor came out, and a couple of Trinidadian actors who were in London came out to participate. So yeah, it was pretty exciting, man. But I think last week I also had another engagement where it was, I think the Sunday when we were supposed to be doing the show, was another friend of mine is having his birthday, and he asked me to come out. So it's like, all right, it's my fault. It's my time to do the show, but I put it off till this week. So yeah, happy birthday going out to my friends out there. You know who you are. It was a good time. It was a good time, man. That's what we like.
Sounds good.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to be continuing the conversation, man, about religion and technology. And we promised this week we're actually going to hit on the religious part of the discussion.
Oh yeah, because yeah.
This is your baby, man. Yeah, take it away. Man.
It's not. There's nothing about this that's brief. So, unfortunately, it's a very. What's that new term? Sargon tried to coin, and he was like thick concepts, where it's like stuff you can't just like easily dismiss away, and like involves a lot of moving parts. Something like that.
For PewDiePie and the big brain. Big brain is very,
big brain.
It's very apt.
Yeah. I just wanted it to be thick with 3 C's, thick concepts. Got it.
Good times.
All righty. So where did we leave off? I think, I think my first point was going to talk about just kind of where we left off, where we were talking about how technology affects your thoughts and cultural norms, right?
Right.
I think we glanced about that briefly, but I think we can go more into it. The common example of that is a lot of our psychology books, or like our psychologists that we kind of built a lot of stuff on. It's from like the late 1800s, early 1900s, right?
Sure.
A lot of those kind of guys like Carl Jung and all of those that are kind of like foundations of like a lot of what we built on. And if you notice, those have a lot of analogies of humans to industry-based things. Like the steam train is like a huge part of a lot of that early stuff, because have you ever heard the term blowing off steam?
Yeah.
That's literally about humans as steam engines.
Sure.
And so they're trying to what do you call it?
Release
parable analogy. Yeah. It's like some kind of parable analogy that how we see our world is kind of based off what our technology is at the time that everybody's obsessed with. And that's kind of like, like big coal ships and, industries and all that stuff. You'll see a lot of those verbiages in a lot of that early psychology that a lot of times we still say, even though, 100 plus years later, because they were that foundational. And I think it's super interesting now in modern times that most things we talk about is based around computers, right?
Sure.
Like your brain is a computer, and your body is like the hardware, and your brain's the software. I've heard a lot of stuff like that.
Sure.
Right. So I don't know. Have you seen a lot of that in the world?
I mean, in that respect, it's a very common thing as language has evolved. Otherwise, we'd all, in terms of religion, we'd still be using Greek and Hebrew. So yeah, obviously language evolved, right? That's not any news. I mean, a lot of phrases we use are Shakespearean that go back to the 1700s and other things, and we're still using them. And I mean, maybe in 100 years, maybe English is not going to be the word. We're going to have maybe you're speaking Mandarin or something. Maybe you will have entirely new adages and phrases that we'll be using. Yeah. I completely agree that language evolves and it changes with the times to try and convey concepts. I mean, the concepts are the same, which is why a lot of
I would disagree with that, because blowing off steam has been debunked multiple times in modern science, but it was still the what do you call it? The gospel back then. Because there's lots of science now that says if you're trying to do things to vent out anger, more often than not, you get more angry and you get more consistently doing that.
Right. That's not the same thing though. Blowing off steam as an idiom still makes sense today.
Yeah.
The treatment that's associated with it has evolved. That's fine. But the phrase itself hasn't changed. Its meaning of what the idiom is actually trying to convey, while it's a bad practice, we still know what it means.
Yeah. But to me, it's kind of like, when doctors said smoking's good for you, right? Blowing off steam was a treatment, you know what I mean? That like, oh, you have all this pent up anger, just go release it and you'll feel better. And more often than not, that actually increases aggression, increases more anger issues than reduces it. So it's actually like opposite science, right? It's like
sure. But I mean, if we're talking the language, the idiom still means the same thing. We know what it is, even though it's bad science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, I think it's not just language. It goes into how you see the world, right? It goes into your own personal perspective of how those views and how that technology gets involved with the culture and the society as a whole. Like, can you name one person you've met that has never used the internet, right?
Yeah, my mom.
Yeah. Yeah. But would you say her perspective on the world is different than everyone else's that is constantly on the internet?
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, she's unaware of internet culture, so she'd be unaware of, the happenings of 4chan and other things like that. Sure, of course. Yeah. But I mean, you could say that about anybody who's disconnected from, the internet. There are people in sub-Saharan Africa who are not connected, but they just have a different culture entirely. They're accessing Middle East Twitter and they're not exposed to a lot of the things that we know. So that's not exactly a universal truth.
Yeah, I don't know. I still think we're kind of saying the same thing and just maybe talking past each other.
Sure.
The technology in there is actually still affecting your perspective of the world, right?
Sure.
And I think I'm trying to find another way to put it. Get a good analogy out of my brain, after I woke up 30 minutes ago. It's a little bit hard, but I'm getting there. I'm still sipping the coffee, hoping it'll help. Oh
yeah, definitely. Coffee always helps. Put some a little guarana in it. That really helps with the focus.
Oh yeah, maybe a little sprinkling of meth. That'll probably help too.
Well, let's call that Plan B.
Yeah, but yeah. So I think we're hitting on the difference between cultural norms and language and stuff. But I think thought processes is also important. Do you know about internet? And there's something called the interneted mind. It's like a slang term that a lot of there's study coming up on of people like Gen Z and young millennials who grew up with the internet and phones, from puberty onward, right? Or even before. There's a lot of research that their concepts of instant gratification and long-term thinking are heavily skewed differently from everyone else that didn't grow up with the internet, right?
Sure.
And it's essentially, it's very similar to addiction in that a lot of social media, a lot of internet is about, push notifications and little tiny dopamine hits of likes and shares and retweets, and the concept of scrolling in your feed. All of those are little tiny dopamine hits over and over and over again. So it's very similar to being in a heavy addiction on how your brain changes the more you use the internet and the earlier you use the internet.
Sure.
Which is pretty interesting. And so that is just going to change more than just your language and culture. That's going to change your thought processes, right? That's actually a brain change. It's similar to somebody, gets addicted to some heavy drug when they're 12, right? It's hard for them to probably shake that off because they don't even know like that was dangerous. Everyone's heard of, well, I don't know if you guys have. In my line of work, we surprisingly see a lot of kids with addiction, more than you would see like, your normal walking through the neighborhood. But it's a whole different dynamic trying to help a kid off something than an adult. And it's a little crazy. So,
I mean, I haven't seen the front line of it, but yeah, I've heard of these studies, and yes, it's definitely an issue. But I mean, just like once upon a time, doctors used to say, yes, smoking is good for you. I'm sure as more and more science comes forward, you're probably going to start to see prohibitions on kids having cell phones until they're 12, or other such things as we learn more and more about these conditions. So I'm completely on board with that. It doesn't change the language though. I mean, how they respond and their want for instant gratification, sure, is a real problem. Right, because a big part of success is delayed gratification, right? Being able to put things off, plan long term, and so forth. I'm interested to see how that kind of relates to our topic today.
Yeah, so that was just kind of me trying to segue into the stuff I want to talk about with religion, because I think those concepts. Because before we were mostly talking about the history and how that applied to cultures, and now I kind of want to just talk about like in general, like the archetypes or the metaphysics of what technology is versus what religion is, right? Sure. If that makes sense. So I think to me, the root of it all is the difference between materialism and like the idea of metaphysical or archetype or consciousness or spirituality, right? To me, those are diametrically opposed concepts, but we still have to deal with both of them, right? I think one of the common terms for that is ghost in the machine. Have you ever heard that phrase?
Yeah.
It's a famous, anime and all that kind of stuff, but it's actually, a concept of that we have a physical material machine that we have, but we also have the ghost in it. That's our identity and our consciousness and our, thoughts and feelings and all that stuff, because this is the tricky thing, and they call it the hard problem of consciousness in science right now. And, there's a lot of like both physicists and philosophers and some theologians are all now come to a point where we're all trying to study the same thing.
Sure.
We're trying to figure out the hard problem of consciousness, right? Because there's no, so when I say material, most people think materialistic. Oh, you buy a lot of stuff. But material in this context is stuff made out of matter that you can physically put a number on, right?
Sure. Something
Something you could measure or weigh or scale or, anything like that. Anything you can like physically hold or put a number onto is usually what we talk about when you talk materialistic. And so when you talk about metaphysic or talk about spirituality or all that stuff, is talking about all the stuff that you can't put a number on, right?
Sure.
So like you can't say I have level 4 consciousness and you have level 5 consciousness, because there's no way to measure it. You're right.
Right.
You either have it or you don't, or you guess, right? Like there's no numbers involved in this. And so I think the interrelation between material world and non-material world or spiritual world kind of thing of your life is the tricky part. And that's where the term of the ghost in the machine comes in. Is the ghost in the machine is how does your spirituality interact with your body and the matter around you, right? And I think technology can't do anything for the ghost in the machine. It can only do stuff for the machine, right? There's no technology that's solved the problem of consciousness or has become self-conscious itself, as far as we know. But
sure,
that toaster's plotting. I saw him. But yeah, it's essentially so much of our life is now based on the technology and the information and the science, which is all of that we're no longer like dealing with the ghost in the machine. And I think that is, at least it's a good hypothetical that what do you call it? Hypothesis, not hypothetical. Hypothesis that's probably a lot of the reasons why we're pretty mentally ill right now. Like, we're in a mental illness crisis. We have so many drugs getting spit out to everybody all the time for trying to change all of their feelings. And I think it's because we're sacrificing the ghost for the sake of the machine, if that makes sense. That's kind of my hypothesis for kind of where we're going forward with this. Does that make sense?
I would agree. I mean, I wouldn't phrase it exactly like that, but yeah, I understand the concept you're putting forth. Yeah, we have denied our, spiritual aspects to our lives. We've made it all academic. We've pitted science against religion, which is not really a true dichotomy. So yeah, there's a lot of cultural pressure to kind of, avoid the metaphysical and stuff like that. But there's a problem with that. There are a lot of things that we enjoy in this world that are metaphysical that we can't quantify. Beauty, for instance, you can't quantify what's beautiful. Love, emotion.
Why do we call women 1 out of 10? Boom, got him. Roasted.
Yeah, but every one man's 1 is another man's 10, right? So it's not objective, is it?
I tried. Hey, I tried.
Yeah. Fair point, though. Fair point. It's not that we don't try. So I mean, the museums of the world are, captures of what we believe to be beautiful, but then there's some things in those museums that are downright hideous, especially when it comes to like modern art and stuff like that. So yeah, I agree that aspect of humanity, that almost the chaos factor that cannot be quantified, has been shoved into a box. And more we're seeing that people are told to just kind of ignore it, just that none of that stuff matters, do your yoga, live in the box, eat the bugs, own nothing, just exist and make your own happiness, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is that's a message that's destined for failure. But ironically, before I hand it off, that's a big problem in the West, but there are other parts of the world that don't have those problems. So a lot of South America and a lot of these places that kind of still involve themselves in shamanic or like the ayahuasca people or ibogaine and a lot of these kind of spiritual pursuits that the ancient world used to have, right? The Greeks had it. Pretty much everybody had it up until the 1960s when, the US declared a war on drugs. These problems are not like the heavy reliance on technology is not saying it's not a problem, but not as big a problem in some of these other people. So that might be a glimpse into what might actually turn this around. But I think we're on the same page.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting you brought up, the live in the pot, eat the bugs. Have you seen I had this conversation yesterday. Have you seen the Amazon meditation box they're putting in the factories?
Yeah, the Amazon box. We actually talked about it, Amos and myself, on the 10K Run podcast. And
oh yeah, it is.
It's a crying closet.
It's very dystopian, right?
Yeah.
And this is an interesting point. Is like and to me that's a perfect example of like when somebody's coming from a material mindset trying to create spirituality, they come up with that. It's like it literally looks like a Babylon Bee article, but it really happened, right?
Yeah.
But you're in this mile-long factory, and you get a 4 foot by 4 foot cube to go in and be spiritual and reset
on
yourself.
Your lunch break or whatever.
Yeah, that you already didn't have enough
free time. Yeah.
And so instead of changing their policies to actually benefit people, they're like, oh, what's the materialistic view of spirituality? Here's a box to be spiritual in. Now go back to work and pee in a bottle. Right?
Yeah. But I mean, on the flip side of that, I don't know if you've heard the story of Brother Lawrence. He was
I know of him, but I haven't read his stuff. Yeah.
Okay. So he wrote a book called Practicing the Presence of God. And he actually used to have these ecstasies while he was washing dishes in the monastery. And I mean, there's accounts of him actually levitating off the floor and all sorts of crazy miracles. But he did the most mundane task, and people will come from all around the region to watch this man wash dishes. And he was just so enraptured in the presence of God, doing the absolute mundane sort of activity. It became such a spectacle. So that is when you've gone completely into the physical or materialistic realm, this is the aspect of your life that is, being ignored. But in fact, if you go very heavily into the spiritual, that experience and that growth can actually spill over into the natural realm. Doing your mundane Amazon job, you will actually find joy and fulfillment in these other types of things. And that's something that I don't think the modern world has really picked up on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. So I think it would be more if I actually read his stuff, kind of thing, because it's hard to grasp it from the Cliff's Notes. But
yeah.
But yeah, it's very interesting. My brother's very big into Brother Lawrence and had his books and read them all the time and stuff. But he's also in that IHOP-y, charismatic-y, crazy side too. So
can
so
be
we'll
slippery
see.
slope. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So he enjoys reading all of the random miracle accounts and then tries to make it happen for himself too. But I don't know if that's how that works. But
cool.
That's
Who knows how it works?
Yeah,
otherwise,
exactly.
Otherwise, we'd all be doing it.
Yeah, and that's my big problem with IHOP is they try to teach classes on how to do miracles, and they charge you a lot of money in tuition for it. So,
I mean, there is theology in a way that you could teach it. You can't guarantee a miracle, though. I think that part is ridiculous, but.
Yeah, it's very spiritual snake oil, in my opinion. But
it can be. It can be.
Getting back on topic, I think a lot of this comes from the Age of Enlightenment, and I think Nietzsche is really important here. Sure. Everyone's heard the phrase, God is dead and we killed him. That's a Nietzsche quote that people use a lot. And a lot of people like atheists and like, like the edgelord atheists always try to quote that and say, haha, like me and Nietzsche are cool. Nietzsche was mad about it. He said that in very sad disgust. Yeah. We fucked that up. And all of that, I think, kind of stems from the Age of Enlightenment in that once you start going full on into the material side of the science and the technology, you're essentially killing God because that's going to devote more of your time and that's going to change your mindset. Right.
I mean, I wouldn't
it's very hard to do both.
Yeah. I wouldn't put all of it on the Enlightenment because there were a lot of Christian philosophers, thinkers, and scientists that came out from that. I mean, the whole birth of science as a discipline was the idea that, God created the world and the universe and it was ordered and that order can be revealed. But yes, definitely the heavy reliance on logic, reason, and the scientific method and the one truth, I guess it has its roots there. Nietzsche was an expression of that. But his ideas really didn't become popular till much later on. I don't know what the actual. It was probably just a slippery slope. It just probably started to decay, and we're seeing the kind of the fullness of it. I don't know if there's really one root to that entire thing.
Yeah, but I think this is one thing that like a lot of like mainstream world and like misunderstand about Nietzsche is like he wasn't a Christian, but he was very spiritual still.
Yes.
Like he had this big spiel about the metamorphosis of the spirit, talking about how humans over time like have different versions of spirituality. And it usually, he says, you start as a camel and then turn into a lion and then you turn into a child. And the child is actually the best kind of thing. Yes. And it's essentially you turn into a yes man to like the cool high school rebel punk into like an actual adult with the world at your fingertips. Right. And he talks about that a lot. He talks about spirituality. And he's very upset that God is dead, right?
Yes.
That we killed him is because we are now, I would say it's a lot of, to me, I don't know if I want to use like pride or ego kind of thing, but it's definitely, we're going to do it ourselves, right?
Yes.
That's a big part of the Enlightenment and the scientific method and all that is we're going to figure it out ourselves, right?
Yes.
And even though that sounds good on paper, it sounds good on theory, I don't think it's done well. And I think that's what we're going to try to get into. Yeah. I think it's done more problems than solutions. IMO. But one of the things that also involves with this, talking about the ghost in the machine, do you know the concept of thumos or tumos?
No,
depending on it's like THUMOS. It refers to, I think it's kind of like the Greco-Roman times. A lot of Greek philosophers talked about it kind of thing. And thumos is their version of spirit or fire in the belly.
Okay.
It wasn't necessarily just, male anger, which is what a lot of times they used it as, but it's also just that idea of spirituality and the spiritedness when say someone's spirited, they're like up and go getter and like ready to move kind of thing. And they concepted that to the concept of the spirit or the consciousness that is separate from the flesh and the body and the mechanical side of you. And I think it's very interesting because you can read and they talk a lot about how to like develop thumos and like what does thumos look like. And I think a lot of that spirituality is interesting. And I think over time, the more we're doing our Age of Enlightenment stuff, the more we're completely trying to cut off that part of us. Right.
Sure.
We want really good desk jockeys. We don't want people to be spirited, right? A bunch of spirited people, specifically, if we want to talk about like the Chad alpha male, spirited, those are actually bad for the social technological norm. They would rather have more gears, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Instead of one that wants its own idea and its own independence and its own spiritedness.
Yeah, I would. I mean, it sounds a little conspiratorial, but I do understand the point you're making, and you're probably right. At the turn of the 1900s, not only was there an explosion of technological advancement, automobile, telephone, all these days, there was actually a lot of new thought about the human condition and what it meant to be human. So you got a lot of people kind of really delving into the dynamics of human interaction and human potential. And we started to kind of realize that, yeah, human beings are actually quite phenomenal beings. And we seem to be able to affect, not only our own consciousness, but the consciousness of things around us. So this is, of course, the observing of the scientific experiments actually changing the state of matter and other things. And this is actually the genesis of the consciousness discussion, because what is consciousness and all these things. And I think to a certain extent, you start to see people like Napoleon Hill coming out, the Think and Grow Rich people. And these are the kind of people who kind of tapped into an idea that your thoughts and your consciousness can actually direct your life. Now, whatever you think of Napoleon Hill and that type of new thought, that's very dangerous for people who are actually in power. And you start to see very strange, and I know it sounds conspiratorial, there are very strange things happening, like Kellogg coming out and kind of trying to eradicate red meat from the diet. You start seeing things that, adding fluorine to the water supply. A lot of things that tend to dull our consciousness, right? Through nutrition and other things like that. And I'm not saying there's some kind of elite cabal that made this plan, but I think there might have been, probably the likes of Tesla and all of these other phenomenal human beings that came out. I think it shook a lot of people in power. And I think societally, at least in the West, things were kind of put in place to try to curtail that to a certain extent. I don't know how true that is, but if I was a maniacal person trying to control and contain human potential, I would do what has been done to society.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And this is a phrase that I think I used it with, we talked about this way back when. I think it's one of the ones where you had to leave early. It was Bobby's last day. And we kind of had a free talk.
Condolences to Bobby and the passing of his mom. Yeah.
Shout out to Bobby. May you do well. We miss you. Feel free to come on anytime, man.
Absolutely, brother.
But yeah, in his last episode, it was me, him, and Amos, because I think you had to leave early that day.
Yes, I only had like 10 minutes on my phone of data or something.
And I brought up this technology and religion briefly, like the most summary cliff notes of it. But one of the things I said in there, and it kind of goes to what you were just talking about now, is how did I put it? A system is not what it says it does. A system is what it does.
Yes.
Right. Kind of like, and I think we can talk about this, and like, it's going to get some weird politics stuff, so we probably can't be very specific on YouTube. But in general,
keep the stream up.
Yeah. When you talk about the idea of like elections and Democrat versus Republic, they have a lot of things they say they are. Yes. But what are they? What are they actually doing? What does that system actually do, and not necessarily what is it saying it's doing? Right.
Yes.
And I can think of all of the small stuff, and a lot of this is also like minarchist, anarchist talking points. It's talking about like, why do we pledge allegiance to a flag? Like, why do we only vote for two parties that we don't actually pick? Right. Why do we do all these things? And it's kind of that deconstruction or questioning like our system as a whole, because you realize what they say it does and what it does are two different things. Right.
Agreed.
So And I think that kind of goes to your point of what you're talking about is like, you could say, like, we could say, oh, our system's all about freedom and liberty. And, you get the choice that matters. But what it actually does is it kind of stifles you, right? It's like actively trying to stifle you and keep you as mediocre and complacent as possible. It's very hard to get ahead. Yeah.
I would agree. That's why, I mean, you look around, we're dealing with some really stupid ideas and people are living in cognitive dissonance, and it's just weird what's happening. And there seems to be like an active campaign against like things that would actually help us, right? Yeah. Things that would actually benefit humanity and our health and other things like that. I'm not saying there's a cabal. I'm not saying, Illuminati or any of that kind of stuff. I'm just saying it's very bizarre around the turn of the century. And maybe human beings were on the cusp of an evolutionary leap and they saw it coming and it threatened, what potentially could control people. Yeah, that's kind of been the thought that's been going on. I don't know. I love these ideas. I love going down these rabbit holes.
Oh yeah, and I have an interesting analogy for it, and I think you will appreciate it because we've both talked about like keto carnivore science and research and things like that. Do you know about the omega-6 versus omega-3 ratios?
Yes, in terms of how much we're consuming a diet
and how much we're what's supposed to for health versus what's being fed to us.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the ratio is supposed to be like 2-to-1, 6-to-3, or 3-to-1, depending on who you ask. And right now, with all of our processed food, it can really only process omega-6. It's very hard to process omega-3. Omega-3 only really comes from wild animals that are eating like actual grass in their actual diet. And that's where a lot of omega-3 comes through, especially like fish. Wild seafood. Yeah. And but the ratio is supposed to be 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, and right now we're eating on average 20-to-1. And
of the omega-6
to 3
only.
Since we're so out of whack, it's actually creating a lot of like, one of the big things is it like inflames everything when you have really high omega-6. And I mean, you guys can Google omega-6 stuff. It'll tell you all of the side effects, but in general, it kind of affects, not majorly, but it kind of affects every part of your body. Correct. When you have those things out of whack. And I use that analogy to talk about the relative of how much you should think about material versus spiritual things, right?
Sure.
I think our society is 20-to-1 and we're supposed to be 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. Like, I think that would be a lot healthier life. But I think since we're doing 20-to-1, not just in our food, but in our ideas and our concepts of material world versus non-material world, I think that's also creating a lot of the dysfunction. Our ratios are off. Yeah. So I thought that was a fun analogy, and I thought you would like that.
Yeah, no, I completely get it. I think I'm sometimes I get an allergic reaction to fish, so I'm taking omega-3 as a tablet.
Yeah.
But I completely agree. And I mean, obviously you've probably had some discussions with vegans, or if anybody's ever had a discussion with a vegan and you try to explain the research and the problems with the questionnaire studies, these epidemiology studies, where you're basically doing research based on questionnaires where people are asked, like, well, how many eggs did you eat last week? Like, God, I barely remember how many I had for breakfast today, but they're basing all of these studies off of less than great science. And for some reason, this bad science is being pushed as the real deal. And nothing explains that greater than the osteoporosis argument about saturated fat. Throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, saturated fat was the enemy, right? That bacon and that cholesterol was killing you. And, you got to cut the fat and cut the salt, and you got to cut all these things and whatever.
Eat sugar instead.
Yeah. And what did we go to? We went to process. So they took out the tallow and the ghee and all the natural fats that were in our foods and replaced it with sugars and high fructose corn syrup and all this other processed garbage. And what happened? Heart disease went up. It didn't go down, right?
Yeah. And obesity and diabetes.
And obesity, everything.
Yeah. Everything.
All of these metabolic issues. And even though the evidence is glaring, right, that something went wrong, you could not beat the saturated fat hypothesis to heart disease. I can't remember what the name is. I just said it. But
what was it, like the lipid hypothesis?
The lipid hypothesis. Yeah. You cannot beat that hypothesis out of people. The brainwashing is so strong.
Yeah.
So I completely agree that the systems we have in place are not really helping us, even though and this is political talking points. Anything a politician piece of legislation says, oh, the Great American Patriot Act or whatever, the Great Restoration of the Voting Act, whatever it says, the opposite is probably what's really going on.
Yeah. It's interesting that now in like 2021, doctors are still telling you to eat low fat and low calorie and all these things. And like doctors, like, are all their textbooks still from 1970? Like, I don't know how that's physically possible. Like, what is that buffering rate between modern research and science to actually telling doctors to tell people this? Like, that's like a 30 or 40 year gap for some reason that we're telling people stuff we thought 30 or 40 years ago still.
Yeah. There's probably a reason for that the academics that have published the original papers are still in power in a lot of these places. So until they kind of either move on or pass on or, into the great beyond, they're holding the gates of power to what actually gets taught. So that's why it usually takes about 30 years for like a true cognitive shift on any of these points.
Yeah, exactly. I would definitely agree with that. So with that, a good segue is talking about what is like the end goal, because it kind of goes into what you were talking about, a couple points ago when you're talking about the early 1900s, and while that's kind of like where we're talking about where you can see some of the stifling. Like one of the examples I think of, and we talk a lot about too in the red pill sphere, is like, what does it mean to be a man? And in the early 1900s, being a man means you did all of your great factory work 9 to 5, and then you came home to your kids and mowed the lawn and fixed the shed, right? That's what it meant to be a man. Part of that involved was you going to your 9 to 5 job and not complaining.
Yes. I would agree with that.
Yeah. And so like, I think it's funny when people talk about the TradCon time machine, where people are like, let's go back to the 1940s or 50s. That's when it was good. And it's like, really? Are you sure? Are you sure it was good? Are you sure you just want to go slave labor at a factory labor, making, less than minimum wage and, just getting by, and your whole life is all of this problems? Like, yeah.
I mean, to be fair to the 1950s, you could have actually raised a household of 3 with a dog on a minimum wage salary in the factory.
Yeah, but who benefits from that? You or the society structure?
I don't, well, both, I suppose, to a certain extent, until the inflation hit. But yeah. Fair point. Point.
Yeah, I think it was like your spirituality, your thumos, like in the 40s and 50s, was still labeled as helping the system, right?
Sure.
And there's a lot of interesting stuff, and I'm pretty sure you know this, but like our school system is based on the factory system. We had bells. We had very specific times. They cared a lot about timeliness. You're clocking in and clocking out appropriately. You have very specific bells, and you have very specific places, and you're being lectured, being used to being sitting down for 8 hours of the day, and doing something. But it's very interesting that even your school system, you were getting started early in the, if you want to call it, indoctrination of factory work and factory life.
Correct.
Yeah. It's very interesting that all of it kind of revolved around keeping the system going and not necessarily for your benefit.
No, I agree.
But another big thing, yeah.
No, I was going to say, like, what came out of the school system? You got a job, and then, policy came in and basically destroyed that. So once upon a time, you could get out of school with a high school diploma, and you can get a pretty decent job. And as you say, our parents and grandparents
middle class, upper middle class, even off
exactly.
Of high school. Yeah.
And then what happened, right? They pushed everybody into college, and that basically made high school meaningless. Having a high school diploma, now you need a degree. And now that everybody's gone for a degree, I mean, most of the bartenders I know are basically degree holders. They can't get work in their field.
Yeah.
So the system has a lot of problems, and when you say that, nobody wants to hear that.
Yeah, exactly. But I think this goes into the idea of dehumanization, right? And I think this is a big part of it. And most people hate that word, and it's kind of a scary word. And honestly, I kind of mean it as a scary word. So I don't really want to lighten or push the brakes on that. I think dehumanization is a pretty real thing when you're coming to all of this. What is the end goal of the system? What would you think? As it appeals to humans?
I mean, what, globally, or like, I mean, any governmental system and structure leads to tyranny, right? That's just the long-term effect of every system. So it basically leads to a ruling elite class, and you eventually end up with some kind of serfdom or slavery for the the plebiscite. And yeah, it's the system is designed to curtail wealth and power for the elites and the people who are in power, and doesn't really offer upward mobility to anybody else. That's kind of, but it's meant to give the illusion per se of how that you can make anything of yourself. Go to college, you'll make $1 million dollars US a year, or it's filled with all these platitudes, but in actuality, it doesn't do any of those things. And I mean, we've seen the evidence of that. Of course, most of the big Fortune 500 company people are not college graduates, but at the same time, they're also not very competition friendly, as we've seen in the likes of Google and Facebook. And we love our YouTube overlords, but they have their issues too. So I think that the overall system is about maintaining power and wealth for those who are in those positions. Now, that before I go off it does not mean that you cannot circumvent the system. It does not mean that you are actually a slave. I think that is the end result. But while you have a modicum of freedom and ingenuity and so forth, you can buck the system. And some people just choose not to play at all. But yes, the societal system that we have in the West, it's based on controlling power and money for the elite.
Yeah. How would you say you bucking the system? Because the other way I can think of that is the off-grid doomsday preppers, or the Uncle Teds, right? They just live in a cabin in the woods and don't talk to anyone.
Those are definitely viable options in like the full monk mode. But then you can also use this. The system inherently has its own flaws in it. You can exploit the system to make yourself wealthy and become an elite. But that's something that they don't teach. And correct me if I'm wrong. When you were in school, did they teach you about money and taxes, and how to start a business, entrepreneurship, anything like that?
No, but the mitochondria is the powerhouse.
Is the power of the cell. Yeah, that's the Reddit meme at this point. That's
boy, I could Pythagorean theorem anything. Give it at me. Throw me some triangles. What's up?
Yeah, this was actually a big complaint that I had when I was going to school, because I knew it was a waste of time. And there's a reason for that. Like even economics, right? If people just had a basic of, obviously there's no economics being taught in school anymore, considering some of the crazy SJW, 2 + 2 = 5 nonsense we see, and the support of communism. But there are reasons, because there are means that a person could actually free themselves from this system to a certain extent and become a wealthy or free individual. There's something called the perpetual traveler. I don't know if you know about these people.
Yeah, it's like the digital nomad.
The digital nomad. I know one of the big guys, the nomad capitalist, he's been interviewed by Rich Cooper and stuff like that. And it's basically people who've, they've created an internet business of some kind, or a transient business that they don't need to stay in one location. And they move around to 3 or 4 locations a year, and they live in these 3 or 4 locations every year without ever having like a home base tax haven. Like they're always on the move. They're perpetually moving, and they're not really paying much taxes apart from whatever commercial VAT or whatever they pay, sales tax on whatever they buy. And there are thousands of these people. Maybe into the millions. I think
you could argue Aaron Clary's pretty close out of our sphere.
He probably is. So there are ways to buck the system if you're really willing to play the game and use the system against itself. But not everybody is interested in that. Not everybody's, the vast majority are never going to find that.
Yeah.
So those are your 2 options. You could go Uncle Ted and just kind of unplug, go on the ranch, dig a well, shoot for game for food, or you can try and beat the system with the flaws that are inherited it.
Yeah, it's but to me, it's still kind of weird, because you still have to be in the system to fight the system, right?
Sure.
In that way, right? You still have to pay taxes. You still have to follow local laws, no matter how bad they are or stupid they are. You still are going to have to deal with cops, right? So it's tricky, but
I mean, it's you do that for long-term gain, right? If your goal is so a great person who wrote about this is, of course, Robert Kiyosaki. And he basically laid it out like, this is how you get rich. This is how the rich do it. Anybody could do it. Start with a job. You buy assets that produce more money instead of, buying the latest pair of Nike shoes. and you build your passive income to the point where you don't have to work anymore. That's basic formula. And yes, of course, you still got to work a job to do that or to get the capital, and you got to pay your taxes. But again, the point we made in the beginning, the willingness to sacrifice now for long-term gain. If freedom is your ultimate goal and that's what you want, yeah, you're going to have to pay the piper for a couple of years until you get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
Whether everybody wants to do that, that's everybody has to decide that for themselves.
Okay. Yeah. So this is where I was going to go in with the question of what's the end goal. So I think the whole God is dead. I think we've replaced God. If you're going fully materialistic thinking, fully matter thinking, the end goal is spreading through utility and efficiency. Utility and efficiency is now God, right?
Right.
Because that's the fastest and best way to expand quickly. You need everything to be utilitarian, and you need everything to be efficient, right?
Okay.
And so that's where you're seeing a lot of this stuff. And this is something interesting that my stepdad actually brought up, is talking about if a company can find a way to measure something, they will use it against you.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
And that's where, and like the whole Amazon thing is like the perfect example, right? Is like they count the seconds of your pee breaks and your smoke breaks and your lunch breaks, right? Because they need it to be as efficient and as utility as possible to keep the machine going, right? And something early in the 1900s that kind of goes with this too is the utility and efficiency of the human species created eugenics. Right? And to me, that is the epitome of dehumanization, right?
Yes.
Because humans are no longer humans. Humans are a piece of the puzzle I want, right?
Right.
You're no longer looking at the people as people. You're looking at the people as utility and efficiency numbers, right?
Sure.
And it's a little fun fact that I don't think a lot of Americans know, but Hitler got his idea of eugenics from us. We did it first.
Who's us? The
American. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Western civilization in general, but America specifically, like we were doing it in the late 20s, early 30s, I believe. There's a couple like famous legal stuff you can look up where like there was trials to castrate like special needs people because to get them out of the gene pool to save the species kind of thing.
I mean, it didn't start with you guys. The Spartans did the same thing. Right?
Yeah.
When the children were born, they'd kind of leave them out to only the strong survive. And to be fair, throughout human history, people with defects and leprosy and other things like that, many times they were killed by the state. In Jerusalem for the more religious society, they would they'd let them beg and they'll get alms and stuff like that. But that's not the norm. That's not the norm of human the human story. So
yeah. But it always comes up
times.
when we have really big empires with really big populations. It's kind of interesting.
Indeed.
When the system gets to a certain function, it has to start caring about the efficiency of their human race that they're using.
Yeah, especially if the government is involved in the healthcare, they take more action towards handling these bigger questions because it's a cost. Every person is a cost to them, so they don't want unhealthy people. That's usually a very sick incentive for them to kind of get involved in eugenics.
Exactly. Yeah. So like to me, it all comes down to the difference between bottom lines versus well-being, right? The material world cares a lot more about bottom lines than your well-being.
Sure.
Amazon meditation box, perfect exhibit A, right?
Right.
Your well-being is actually just at the bare minimum of a utility and efficiency to still try to keep you there as a worker and not actually change much, right?
Sure.
And if there's no, like when you're going into the realms of science and technology and logic and reason, like we hear the phrase all the time, facts don't care about your feelings, which is true to a point. However, feelings still exist. And that's still a human thing, right?
Correct.
Like, facts don't care about your feelings can be useful in certain things when you're actually talking about meta stuff, but you got to realize you're still talking to humans, right?
Yes.
And the well-being of humans is where the religion part comes in. Heather, there you go. That is the point of the religion, the spirituality, or the omega-3 from the previous analogy, right? Yes. Is you need to talk about that and you need to discuss that, and you can't just kill God and think everything's going to be okay, right?
Agreed.
I think this is the huge thing, and I think the concept of thumos is huge, right? that idea of your spiritedness and what you want to do, and how much the system hates that. It tries to stifle it or tries to mend it into what helps the system instead of you.
Mhm.
I think we can get all of that from religion, but we're just cutting it off. And I think this is the part where we disagree is I think you can't separate the baby in the bathwater with technology in the age of enlightenment. I don't think we can keep the good and take out the bad.
Right.
And I think that's the big impasse that a lot of people have. It's the biggest speed bump, right?
Right. But I mean, you could say that about anything. You could say, I mean, there are a lot of things that can be used for both good and bad. And you know, we have to trust people to make their choice. And from a theological perspective, if and I mean, not to make it an end times discussion, you know, because I hold the preterist view and I hold the idea that we're going back to the Garden of Eden in some capacity. We don't know what that looks like. I'm sure technology will play a role in that. So like last week we discussed about how, you know, if a person doesn't work, you know, their brain is still kind of carnal and Neanderthal thinking. And if they're not doing anything, yeah, they kind of short circuit. Yes, that is true from a naturalistic perspective. But at the same, from a theological perspective, the work was a curse. It was part of the narrative of the Garden of Eden. And that, you know, by the sweat of your brow, you will earn bread. And that was actually part of the curse that Christ broke when they put the crown of thorns upon his head. Blood came from his brow and he, you know, sweat blood. So in theological terms, we're actually going back to a kind of Edenist state where we work not because we have to, but because we want to. I don't know what that looks like. I'm not even going to pretend I know what that looks like.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's a pretty deep dive that would take way longer than
I'm just saying in that respect, if all we had was the physical manifestation and the materialistic view, it's dark, which I think we agree on. But at the same time, if the ultimate outcome is a restoration of all things, and we're kind of going back to this garden-like state, it means even in this darkness, God can use anything to turn it around for his purposes. So that's why I can't say that on a sum it's all bad, or, you know, I think we have to leave it up to individuals to learn and to work their way through it. That's kind of the distinction.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's tricky because it's that thing of like, I don't know. There's a proverb I like that talks about, and I think we talked about this way back when I was on Shitlord Preachers. I was talking about,
it's like
so
4 years ago.
yeah. That I was talking about. One of my favorite verses is, "You have to prepare your horse for battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord." Right?
Yes.
We still have to prepare the horse. We still got to do shit while we're here.
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's not works-based salvation, but I mean, you could still deal with the times, right? Even though God has the end game in plan, right?
Correct.
And to me, I think that's one of the most important verses that like a lot of people, or at least the message behind that verse, isn't really getting portrayed out a lot. Most people are a little too loosey-goosey, or they're so wrapped up in their own anxiety and thoughts and feel like they have to control everything that the victory belongs to them, but it doesn't, right? But likewise, you also have the opposite where people just, you know, watch porn and eat Cheetos and binge Netflix, doing the whole, God will figure it out, right? I think there's a medium there that we're supposed to do with that verse, right? You're still supposed to do what you feel led to do and still have that spiritedness and still deal with spiritual terms, but not necessarily just sit and God will figure it out. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. I don't. I know we're not at the end, right? I know we're not in that Eden state in any kind of capacity. But I think that is God's long-term plan is the restoration of all things. So at some point, and it actually talks about this, the sign of the end is not the camel farts in the Middle East and, whoever's going to negotiate a peace treaty. No. The sign of the end is that human beings begin to live longer like we did in the beginning. So we're actually going to have a race of human beings that live for 900 to 1,000 years. So that means, because the last enemy that's defeated is death, right? So it talks about that. Christ is reigning over everything. All of these principalities and powers are bowing to him. One day, this SJW spirit, whatever incarnation that is, that will bow to the spirit of Christ. He will be Lord over all, and it will be victorious. And the last enemy to bow is death. So I know we're not anywhere near that, because we're not living for hundreds of years yet. But that might be coming, and that's going to come through the technology somehow. At least either that or we have some kind of enlightenment when through our consciousness we're able to like reset our DNA, which I wouldn't rule out. That's possible, I suppose. So yeah, in the interim, yeah, we got work to do. There's no question about that.
Oh yeah. By the way, this is a little funny side piece. Sorry, I forgot to pull it up before the show, so I had to pull it up real quick.
Sure.
But do you know about? So Canada's pretty big on the woke right now. The Prime Minister
and Canada. Oh yeah,
Canada. Yeah. It's very big on the woke. And a friend showed me this yesterday. The Canada Organization for Gender and Research, and a lot of it's based on like trying to make the world more gender fluid and non-binary and genderless, essentially, and it's all of that stuff. And do you want to know what their let me see if I can. Do you want to know what their symbolism is?
Sure.
It's here, I'll share it.
Okay.
COGS, Canadian Organization for Gender and Research.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah.
All multicolored too. That's fancy.
It's we're all rainbow cogs now, but we're still cogs. Like, do you want to be a cog? It's so freaking ridiculous. But I thought it was funny. It was so apt to exactly what we're talking about. I was talking about the system like feigns your individuality, but really for its benefit, right?
Yeah.
And I just thought that was hilarious.
I mean, in every civilization collapse at the end, there tends to be a push of the gender fluidity. Mm-hmm. So you tend to see more kind of androgynous characters and men being more feminine and stuff like that. So this is not new. This is, you're right. We saw it with the Greeks, the Romans did it, Babylonians, Persians, they had all of that in between. So, I'm not surprised. And this philosophy will collapse like all the others. And we go back to what works. And this there's nothing new under the sun. We're going in circles.
Yeah. All right. Are we ready to go to like the final chunk? The final point?
Sure.
All right. And I think we glimpsed on it briefly, but we're going to talk about dying and death.
Dying.
Right?
Yes.
And the difference between death and spirit to me is the material world versus the spiritual world of death is like death gives meaning to living, right?
It can, yes.
If you live forever or none of that matters, right, your living is boring. And I think the most common example of that is, have you ever played a video game and put in the cheat codes for God mode?
Oh, yeah. IDG, QG or something. I can't remember what it was for Doom, but yeah.
But how much fun was that game after you put on God mode?
No, it wasn't great, but I mean, I still put on cheat codes every so often when I just want to relax. Like I just want to do something easy.
But like the idea of God, the idea of God mode completely defeats the purpose of the game, right? So if you do God mode and you can't die in Skyrim, you'll probably quit playing that game in about 20 minutes, right? Whereas the people who put in 100 hours, right, when you're playing by the normal rules, so to speak. And to me, that's like the perfect example of like death gives purpose to living, right? If you can't die, then why should you care about what you do with your life, right?
Right.
And I think a really good example of that as well is have you ever seen the TV show Preacher? No. Oh, it's one of my favorite of all time. It's based on a DC comic of like, he's not necessarily a superhero. He's like a redneck, Texas pastor, but he gets possessed with the voice of God. Like literally. Oh, cool. So he could speak things and it happens as if God says it. And so he's like super overpowered, but he's a reformed hitman that's now trying to be a pastor like his dad was. And so he has all these weird violent tendencies he's still dealing with. So he does all this weird stuff. And one of the best scenes ever is there's like this annoying kid that keeps trying to ask him questions all the time. And he was like, will you go to hell? And then you see him getting dragged under the church into actual hell. And he's like, oh God. And that becomes like one of the plot points is him trying to get back into hell and get his friend out because he just said it out of anger. But the reason I brought that up is because his best friend is an Irish vampire that's 200 years old. And he can't die. And so you could just see how miserable his life is because all he does is drink and drugs, trying to find the hardest drugs he can just to deal with that problem of he can't die and how that fucks with his mentality.
Sure, sure.
It's a very interesting show. Yeah, it's about a pastor and his best friend Irish vampire that can't die.
I would say, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I'll have to look into it. It sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
If we have long life just for the sake of materialism, yes, you're probably gonna go crazy. And especially if we age, as you know, if you're, you know, by 100 you're all crippled and basically a vegetable, but you're gonna live for like another 800 years. Yeah, that's probably gonna suck. However, if it is that there is the spiritual aspect and we tap into that consciousness and we realize that there's more to this life than the material, that might actually be very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you've ever spoken to like the Buddhist monks and how they do their meditations and stuff like that. But it's an ecstasy for them. They really love it. Like they would spend hours just in meditation. Yeah. And they say it's better.
I mean, you eventually have to get there, but when they get there,
yeah, of course. So if you have a couple hundred years and your consciousness is very much attuned to the presence of God, and you're kind of like doing a Brother Lawrence every day in ecstasies while you're washing dishes, that might be so bad. I don't know. I'm just saying it may not be as bad as it sounds, but you would need the spiritual. You would need that aspect of it because the materialism cannot sustain you for a couple thousand years. So.
Oh, hey, shout out to Michael.
Hey, thank you very much, brother.
God bless you as well. Salute. But yeah, one of the interesting I talk about actually in my job too, in counseling, is we talk a lot about when we talk about death and stuff like that. We talk about deathbed confessions or deathbed wishes and desires.
Right.
When's the last time you heard somebody on their deathbed say, "I wish I made more money. I wish I researched more about moon phases." Right.
Yeah,
none of them.
Yeah, none of them. Yeah, it's always. I wish I spent more time.
All with materialism you cared about went out the window.
Right? Exactly.
And to me, that is like the pivotal point of the difference between spirituality and materialism. Is like when you're dead, you're dead, and every single thing you did based on materialistic mindset does not matter.
Agreed.
Right.
Agreed.
Yeah, it's a huge point. And I actually have a quote from Uncle Ted, if you want me to read it.
Sure.
We all have to die sometime, and it may be better to die fighting for survival or for a cause than to live a long but empty and purposeless life.
Amen. I would agree with that.
That's like the ending exclamation point of Uncle Ted.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, so what are your, I guess to bring it back to the religion, what would you say is what are your views on death then?
Like my personal ones?
Sure.
Like, it happens.
You don't say.
Yeah. I think a lot of like, oh, are you going to heaven or hell or purgatory or all that stuff? I think a lot of it is not crystal clear in the Bible. So I don't really pick a side and champion a side of what happens after death. It's not really my business, my honest opinion. Like, we'll figure it. We'll build the plane when we get there. Right.
Are you worried about death at all? Like, you know, is it something that bothers you?
Depends on the day. Honestly, overall, no. I don't want to I don't like the idea of dying of like illness. That bothers me.
Sure.
But if I die doing something super Chad, that'd be cool. Like just fighting a bear, you know, that'd be pretty sweet. Easily top 5. If you die fighting a bear, that's like the ultimate way out, in my opinion, because you're supposed to lose. But if you win,
that'd be epic.
Yeah. It's like 99 to 1, you're going to lose. But if you win, like it's the ultimate, you know, David and Goliath story. So,
I mean, I say that because the fear of death is a big thing for a lot of people to kind of come to grips with. And a lot of people, some of them just never start living because, you know, it's an existential crisis for them to kind of consider what death is and the end for them, sort of thing. And of course the materialism can't answer that question.
Yeah.
So yeah, I figured we could
all the materialism can do is try to extend your life so that you can keep doing stuff for it.
Correct. But if you're at peace with that, and I think I'm pretty settled with that, I've had a lot of death in my family and stuff like that, and it's not always been sad for me. It's kind of like, yeah, I'll miss them and stuff, but I kind of always knew I'd see them again, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think confronting the fear of death is a very big part to your spiritual growth, and yeah, then you could really start living.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's what I got out. Do we have any final questions or thoughts, or we can throw the link up in the chat?
Yeah, I'll put the link out right now. Yeah, and I mean, I like the conversation. I mean, we really haven't addressed. I mean, are you concerned that the technology is altering the religion, though? Is that something you're concerned about, or would you say it's kind of isolated because technology is more materialist versus the spiritual?
Yeah. Well, I think it forces the religion to think more about material things. Like, think of how much a lot of churches now are trying to move into that social justice woke stuff, right?
Right.
That's all very materialist things. And you could argue, can't say certain things on YouTube, but there's also kind of a materialistic agenda in it too, right? Look at these problems instead of these problems, right?
Yeah.
And,
but I mean, even with that, it's a teething process because the pendulum will swing back in the other direction at some point, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It almost feels, yeah. I don't know how much I want to say here, but yeah, I got a lot to say on that.
I mean, I have to be optimistic. I have to be optimistic that at the end of the day, like, if we eventually end up having kids at some point, not you and I personally, but I mean, just, in general, I have to believe that the next generation is going to be brighter. Like, if the kind of craziness that we see going on where 2 + 2 = 5 is allowed to continue.
Yeah.
It's a very frightening prospect of what the future is going to be. Right.
Yeah.
So, but again, that might be a couple of years removed from me. And I'm thinking, okay, if I have kids, I have to think, okay, in 20 years or 15 years or whatever, that pendulum's got to swing in the other direction. Yeah. Otherwise, it may be kind of immoral to bring kids into the world.
Yeah, I don't know. I think usually for like that big of a pendulum swing, there's probably going to be some big collapse.
Possibly.
I don't think it's going to be a smooth pendulum swing.
That is always the risk. And
and it's just what collapse and how hard. And I don't know. Sometimes I kind of want a big one.
To reset the curve.
If you want to think super long term, it's way better to have a big collapse. And and that was part of Uncle Ted's philosophy, is like, if we make collapse happen now, it's less dangerous than if we let it happen naturally in 100 or 200 years. That was his philosophy, right? And that's why he did all that dumb stuff. He was playing the trolley problem at the end of the game. He was trying to kill the one person so he didn't kill the 4 people, right? So yeah, it's interesting. I don't condone his actions. I don't think he did the right thing, so to speak. But it's if you read his books, it's pretty obvious what he was trying to do, and it was not malicious. Makes sense.
He was trying to get attention for what he thought was, a systemic issue in society. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I agree with a lot of his philosophy, but at the same time, because of, the idea that we are going towards the restoration of all things, I can't say it's all bad. And I think that's kind of where we had our disconnect last week. It's that God can use anything. That's kind of my point. Even though it might be affecting society bad at this moment, I think there's a way this thing can turn around. I don't know what that's going to be, but I remain positive and optimistic.
Yeah, I'm not, but
yeah, obviously.
I think the correction is going to be painful. To say it as undertone as possible.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that the correction won't be painful. Right, the collapse of the Roman Empire, destruction of Jerusalem. There are a lot of cataclysmic events that reset the clock in a lot of ways. I don't dispute any of that, but I think in the long run there will be, a restoration of some kind.
Yeah. How long? What's your
who knows?
I've seen a lot of like big collapse guess. I've seen a lot of people shooting for 2040s, 2050s. So
it's possible.
They had some good evidence behind it. So
yeah. I mean, honestly, we don't know. We until we get to that point, you probably wouldn't know. It's like, the frog in the boiling water. Yeah, you don't know until it's upon you, sort of thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, nobody's jumping on, man. So I don't know if we're gonna call it there. Hey, Betty, good to have you with us.
Hola. Yeah. Do you got any final thoughts? Anything like that?
No, I would say it's a good discussion. We definitely have to separate out the spiritual aspects. Because again, you're not going to find meaning in the materialistic, and the societal push right now to kind of atheize and naturalize everything. I think is going to have, well, we're seeing has consequences already. So yes, there is a need for evangelism. There's a need for people to reconnect with their spirituality, get back into a community of faith. I think that's very important as well. As you talked about, when people are on their deathbed, it's the connections, it's the family, it's the friends. I remember one story of, well, it wasn't my grandmother, but a friend of mine. They were going through pictures like of an album. I don't know if you told me this story or who. They were going through an album, and the grandmother pulled up a picture of like the Grand Canyon or something like that. And she looked at it and like, what is this from? And she said, it's the Grand Canyon. And she said she went on a trip with her friends or whatever. And she kind of stopped like, why did I take a picture of the Grand Canyon? I should have taken a picture of my friend at the Grand Canyon. Like the people are what mattered.
Yeah.
And
there's 200,000 photos of the Grand Canyon without your friend online, right?
Exactly. So I think that's something we need to stress that it is really connections with people. And I mean, okay, we might disagree on this, but I believe that comes from the fact that God is a community. He's, the triune being or the triune nature of, in the classical Christian tradition suggested, human beings are communal in nature, which is why the first thing that wasn't good in the garden was the fact that Adam was alone. So it just stresses how important those connections are. We need people, we need those connections. And yes, as you've quite rightly said, the technology is never going to be able to replace that.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I would say for my final thoughts, there's a really good music video, but you have to like death metal. There's a very good song. I kind of want to link it in. You
can put it in the chat.
You
could probably name the album or the artist in the meantime.
Yeah, it's Becoming the Archetype. It's a Christian deathcore band, and they have a lot of very interesting theology that I think is in their stuff. It's very deep, and a lot of it, like, you could study it for like a week, try to figure out all the messaging and meaning, and they're putting in all their lyrics. It's not just like, yay, Jesus. They do have one of those. They did kind of ish. I also lost hair, which helps, but I shaved it Friday because I got sick of it. Got to the point where I had to like start combing it, and I was like, it's too much work. Yeah, that's how I know it's getting too long, that I actually have to do something after I get out of the shower. And that's when I know it's time. But let's see. I got it. I'll post it in here. Boom. Did it link? I don't know. Maybe you have to post it to make it link. I just put it in the main thing, but I can put it in the private chat so that's an actual link for you.
Okay, I'll copy it here.
Yeah.
And I will put it in the chat. Here we go.
But it talks, It's essentially the song is called Artificial Immortality. And it's talking about very similar concepts that we're talking about here. And it's talking about the dichotomy, and it's great because the album is called Dichotomy, and they're just talking about all these opposites. And this one was about nature versus technology, or nature versus artificial, right? And it's talking about artificial immortality versus dying a beast, and it's better to die a beast than live artificial immortality.
Interesting.
And, it's very interesting, and it's the difference between like organization and organism, right? We're organisms, and we're trying to force ourselves into be organizations.
Interesting. I'll check it out, man. Yeah, definitely.
It's a very good book. It's a very good song. It's very interesting. Yes. And if you like heavy stuff, like, it's pretty up there. It's probably in my top 10 heavy stuff that I listen to. You'll like it. If you hate metal, just
I love metal
and read the lyrics.
Awesome. Awesome.
But embrace the beast, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Get that bestial thumos, pump your chest. Be okay with being an animal. Don't try to be a robot.
Harambe would be proud.
Yeah, and he died to a gun, which is technology.
There we go.
Yeah,
and it was all downhill from there.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, bro, I think that's a wrap there. I think we've kind of covered the gauntlet. So I want to thank everybody for coming on and viewing. I think we had up to 9 people at one point, which is pretty impressive. That's like a new record. So yeah, thank you everybody. Be sure to hit the like button. Of course, if you're watching this at some point in the future and you got questions, leave a comment below. If you want to connect with CONK or myself or any of the other panelists that we've had on the show, all of the links are, of course, below. Next week, we are on CONK's channel.
Yes.
And yeah, same time next week. Yes, this guy, right.
I hate how everything's, I'm so bad with mirrors and reverses.
I know, it's all backwards here.
Yeah.
But with that said, hey, everybody, thank you for watching. God bless, and we will see you all next week.